Welcome to Uncertain Things. Today we have right now here in the virtual studio, Arash Azizi. Arash, I don't know if you know, is Israeli. I'm a journalist with some background in history, and I've just consistently admired and respected your insight and perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict specifically, but the Middle East in general.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
I don't think it's kind at all. I think it's all attributable to your amazing work and your effort to remain consistent and sincere and intellectually honest about it, which is, again, remarkable. And that's not to say that we agree about everything. And I think we're going to explore some of those differences in this conversation. But many people are commenting on the current conflict who approach it with what I would kindly call zero good faith and matched only with a lot of intellectual dishonesty. So that's not the sort of conversation that we're having here. We're not here to have a debate of fake posturing, but rather I want to bring somebody who I so deeply respect and where we have some points of disagreement. So I might change my mind or evolve on those issues, or at least better understand them. So that's the setup for this conversation.
Of course, it would be great. Thank you.
So just before we go into current events, can you give us a little bit of a background of your research and your work? You wrote about Soleimani, and more recently you wrote what Iranians Want. So give us a bit of a background.
Yeah, so I'm a historian of 20th century leftist movements, broadly speaking. I'm interested in global history of communism and socialism. I'm from Iran originally, born and bred in Iran. So obviously I have a lot of interest in my home country and the politics of my country and our region. As for my books, my first book, Shadow Commander, Soleimani, U.S. and Iran's Global Ambitions. Really, it's a book about Qasem Soleimani, this Iranian commander that helped spread the influence of the Islamic Republic over the region. And it fits with my interest because, I primarily looked at it as sort of a history of ideas, even there. How was the Islamic Republic founded? How was it able to spread its ideas around the region? And my second book, which will be published in a couple of months, is What Iranians Want, Women, Life, Freedom, which is an exploration of this revolutionary movement that we had in Iran in 2022, last year. It sort of continued until this year, which was a movement, amazing movement, and tens of thousands of Iranians led by women came out and protested against the regime. So in the book, I really try to look at really a variety of Iranian civil movements, civil society movements that were behind this movement, and that led to this woman life freedom moment in 2022 and 2023.
So let's talk a little bit about Iran again before we get to the current conflict. It's interesting that your focus is from the left revolutionary movement. So correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the impetus of the 78 revolution came from the left, right? Or am I wrong?
No, of course. Yeah, of course. The left had a very big role in the victory of the Iranian Revolution in 79. Although left broadly speaking, although it wasn't the leading force in it, the leading force, was Ayatollah Khomeini, who was of course an Islamist, and it certainly wasn't it was very marginalized very quickly right after the revolution.
The revolution starts in a broad public response to the corruption of the Shah, and creates weird bedfellows between, I guess, the Marxist left and the religious theocratic Islamism of Khomeini. How does this play out, and at what point do we see the break?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and I'll give you my answer. Whenever I'm telling my students about this, I sort of make a disclaimer that that's my answer. It's a bit of an unorthodox answer in many ways. The very field of Iranian studies for the last few decades has always been involved with this sort of question of what went wrong. How did 79 happen? I look at it primarily in the context of what we now call global 60s. That's, academic speak for this decade of 1960s and 70s. I personally call it the long 60s to sort of bring it up all the way to 79. the characteristic of this era everywhere in the world, right? In the United States, in Europe, in Middle East, everywhere in the world, was really looking for radical solutions, and radical not in the way that communist parties of the past had been radical, but of course, it was the age of counterculture, and it was the age of sort of unusual answers. It was really the age of challenging even the opposition parties, right? The understanding that we needed radically new answers, new spiritualities, was very common. That's why so many in California also started as sort of broadly leftist, but ended up in sort of Buddhist communes, right? So the way Khomeini is able to gain dominance over the Iranian movement, I would say two things about it. So first, it has to do with this thing that, it's very easy now to say, well, theocratic Islamic Republic is such a terrible thing. How did people go for it? But at the time, this idea that you can have an Islamic spiritual experiment sounds great to many people. I mean, Michel Foucault, of course, famously goes to Iran and absolutely loves it. And when Iranian feminists tell him, look, this is probably not a great idea for Iranian women, Foucault basically says, no, you don't understand it. You're just useless liberals, and you don't understand the spirituality.
Isn't that the essence of the relationship of the Orient and Western leftists, the Western post-liberals telling people in the Middle East, no, you don't get it. You're just tools of the liberal paradigm. Let me tell you what will liberate you.
Yeah, I think it's very telling, and of course, it's not just 79, but people today who sort of defended this stuff. I would say there's a very real danger in this country, United States. The left, broadly speaking, doesn't have real commitments to liberal democracy. I think this is very important, and really, it doesn't understand it, and it's a sort of very strange thing to live through. It understands it as if when democratic rights are under attack, the left usually starts to defend them, on a one-on-one basis, right? If somebody is arrested, we all get up in arms. But then it doesn't actually have a commitment to say, okay, this as a whole, this rule of law, this liberal democratic, rights, they really matter. And I think that's extremely dangerous.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a clarifying question. You said there was like kind of a attraction to a new type paradigm of spirituality or something that was very attractive. Can you just briefly explain what was seductive about it? What was it exactly that that had pull at that moment?
There's something about Ayatollah Khomeini. He is a very high-ranking religious figure, of course. He's an important Shia Ayatollah. He speaks very vaguely. Even though if you listen very carefully, and if you read everything he writes, which of course no one does, he has always been clear about what he wants. What he wanted, which is what he got, was his idea of governance was most closely based on Plato's philosopher king. He basically believed a wise religious man, preferably himself, will be able to rule the country according to some sort of wisdom. He was anti-democratic really resolutely. In fact, the Islamic Republic, it's sort of a bit of a compromise. He didn't want a republic even, right? And it's not just the person of Khomeini, right? There is an entire now forgotten genre of what I call a term that I've sort of coined left Islamism, which which uses Islam and leftist language. This is not just three people in a bar, right? This includes its mass organizations. There's a thinker called Ali Shariati, who's Iranian, but he's based in Paris at some point. Shariati really wants to infuse Islam with a revolutionary message. He's very anti-clerical. He wants to he wants to, as I said, he wants to make a political ideology out of Islam. And he's very popular. He has, his cassette tapes in Iran are listened to by hundreds of thousands of people. There's this organization called People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran on the basis of Shariati's ideas. Not just Shariati, but some others, which becomes perhaps the largest political party in the Middle East at some point after the revolution. So there's a lot of attempts there to fuse Islam with revolutionary ideologies. And as I said, I think the reason this thing is very possible is that this is the era where everything is possible, right? But the last thing I'd say in that regard, though, is that so this is the general picture, right? But the history will always works in this way. The scene is set by a variety of forces, And Khomeini is just a great politician. He's able to wield forces. But of course, there's a war with Iraq that really helps things. So he becomes this war leader. And he is able to bring people behind him and ultimately eliminate everybody else. Different political forces support Khomeini because they want different things from him. And they also don't think that this sort of slightly strange, 80-something-year-old mullah is actually able to outsmart them politically. That's the other thing.
He's underestimated.
Definitely. Yeah, in a very real ways, he's underestimated. The thing is, this old guy, he will be a symbolic head of the revolution, and he comes to Iran. Of course, you have to remember, at no point in history of Iran or anywhere else in the Middle East had mullahs ran a government. The idea that a bunch of mullahs, sort of clerics, will be able to run a government, be cabinet minister, president, build bureaucracies was just unbelievable. It wasn't something that they thought it was possible. So they support him. They think he will be they compare him to Gandhi often, right? They think he will be a Gandhi-like figure. He will sit in Qom, this city near Tehran, which is the religious heart, and he will publish some moral messages from time to time. And it's these men in suits who will run the revolution. But of course, it doesn't quite pan out like that.
So how does it change? How does the political power shift so much that it becomes probably one of the finest example of total theocratic rule?
Mm-hmm. So the founding ideas of the Islamic Republic becomes this idea that Khomeini had called Velayat Faqih, or the guardianship of jurists, is how it's often translated. As I said, this is an idea based on Plato's philosopher King. But underneath it all, it's an absolute rule for the leader. And this is passed in the constitution. So he is given the supreme leader or the guardianship of jurists. But I would say, yes, even though the constitution gives sweeping powers to this figure, because Khomeini had been very careful not to speak a lot about politics directly, like he would speak broadly against the Shah, but he never associated himself with a faction or a group, right? He was really seen as this father of the nation figure. Of course, he was madly popular, right? He was seen as having someone who had overthrown the Shah. He had led a revolution, right? But the different political groups in the country, I believe, yes, thought that they would be the one who would be running the actual show. And these different groups include, liberals, include sort of these left Islamists that I talked about, include the Communist Party of Iran, the Tudeh Party, which is a very strong political force. And they have a series of big differences with each other, and they're fighting each other. What are they fighting about? First of all, this is the problem of having a so-called Islamic Republic. What does it really mean for a republic to be Islamic? No one really knows. Will it be capitalist or will it be socialist? What kind of socialist will it be? What will it be? Most importantly, its international orientation. Is it going to continue to be pro-US as Iran had been under the Shah, or will it be pro-Soviet Union, or will it be something else? So as they are doing these fights with each other, a really ferocious struggle happens between them, and Khomeini it starts to have a force on his side that had not been perhaps predicted, which is a bunch of sort of his clerical lieutenants, I would say. So these are sort of activist clerics who are really able to come together. They found a new political party called the Islamic Republic Party. And of course, they found this new military militia called Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, IRGC. And they're really able to sideline everyone else. There are very particular political events that make this happen. For example, the first prime minister after the revolution is a very liberal guy, Mehdi Bazargan. He's a liberal. He's been, liberal by the standards of the movement. He's, I would say, liberal soft Islamist, right? He's the kind of guy, he's kind of a physics teacher. He's not a rabble-rousing revolutionary by any standards. And he's sidelined very quickly. So what happens in November of 1979, there's an attack on the U.S. embassy in Iran, and a political crisis opens, which leads to Bazargan's resignation, and a bunch of other sort of contingent events like this that end in 1981. I would say 1981. So it's after 2 years is when Khomeini is really able to consolidate his rule. And this, you could also look at it in this way. Many different groups, they never kind of unite with each other against Khomeini. They're fighting each other on a variety of points. The Communist Party, to the party, is the one that most resolutely supports Khomeini to the end. So that's until 83. And by end, I mean it's when Khomeini goes after them in 1983 and puts a lot of them in jail and executes them and all that. So when I say esprit to the 60s, I sort of put it in a very generic terms, spirituality and all that. But you have to remember, part of this was that all these groups were armed, right? They had traditions of armed struggle and guerrilla struggle. They were against sort of patient politics. They had agitated against it. So after the revolution, they continued to do armed activities. And the People's Mujahideen Organization goes assassinating a lot of leaders of the Islamic Republic, for example, in 1980 and 1981. So it's really sort of a violent time. And the Islamic Republic is able to really establish itself in the midst of this violence. Again, we have to also remember that Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, had attacked Iran in September 1980. So this all happens while the Islamic Republic also finds itself in a war with Iraq. And there are also regional revolts all over Iran.
Which is prime opportunity for consolidation of power domestically.
Exactly. And it's a sort of Khomeini calls it a gift from heaven. And he openly calls it that, right? And the war, he says, will become this, it's this sort of revolutionary laboratory. And it goes on for 8 years. Famously, of course, Khomeini says the path of Jerusalem goes through Karbala, which Karbala is a city in Iraq. The idea is that we'll take Iraq first, and then, we can go to Israel finally. Although actually Iran gets help from Israel. Islamic Republic of Iran gets help from Israel in the war in the 1980s, which is one of those more unexpected Middle Eastern sort of terms of power. But at any rate, yes. So the story of establishment of the regime, is built. I think it's based on this broader historical era, which allowed these extremities to be mainstream for this short period. And in a way, Iranians are victims of the long-term fate based on what could have been a short-lived political moment.
Right.
These groups don't come to power. This kind of 60s groups don't come to power in a lot of countries. If they had, they also presumably would have had sort of radical fates. And, examples like Cambodia and others, you can say they're kind of similar. Of these groups that come to power, Maoists come to power in Cambodia and really do these very radical societal experiments that in effect mean killing of millions of people.
Yep, the extermination of political opposition, and yes, and also dragging down the country into economic despair. So I wonder how, at what point do you move to the US? How much of your life did you spend in Iran? And because I'm interested in how, before we turn back to geopolitics and geostrategy, I wonder how your family was affected by all of this.
Well, I came to the US. I left Iran last time in 2008, so when I was 20, but I've lived in other countries. I've lived in Canada and Germany and United Kingdom and Malaysia and a couple of places. But I came to the United States in 2017 to do my PhD, which I finished a few months ago. So, that's thank you. So that's the end of that journey. So I've lived 20 years in Iran. That's in immigration. That's sort of a late cutoff date, which means that, I'm very Iranian in this way. But I'm also, I've always remained in Iranian politics and sort of Iranian media and Iranian world, if you will, even after.
You can take the man out of the Middle East. You can't take the Middle East out of the man.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So I'm very much involved in Middle Eastern politics and Iranian exile politics, I guess.
Growing up with your family, what's the tone when you talk about politics? What's the day to day? I know in Israeli society, you don't have a single Friday night dinner where you don't get into politics and hear the general opinion and what the Israeli street thinks of this or that. How does it work in Iran?
Yeah, no, I mean, Iran is very political as well. Iran is very political. And you have to remember, Iran has seen a lot of, large scale political events just during my lifetime, right? So, when I was 9 years old, President Khatami, this reformist guy, was elected as president in 1987. So that's, it was an opening of a big era of a lot of hopes for democratic change in Iran. Of course, it didn't quite plan out that way. 2009, we had a mass uprising, a green movement, a green revolution, as some called it. Then we had the whole nuclear negotiations and the Iran deal, which was inked in 2015. Again, sort of a lot of hopes opened up in Iranian society. And then, of course, we've had rise of many other rounds of revolutionary movements in Iran against the government in 2017, in 2019, in 2020, and finally in 2022 and 2023. With family and everybody else, what do you think about the sanctions imposed by the U.S.? What do you think about different political figures who attempt to lead this movement? What do you think about whether to vote or not vote in the elections? These are always sort of contentious issues amongst Iranians. And
that's actually an interesting question. The question of voting in the election. What is your, where do you fall in this? When you know that the election is at least to a large extent rigged by the central figure who will get what he wants.
The elections in 2009 were quite likely rigged, right? That's why we had the Green Movement.
Right.
But other elections from 1997 to 2017, the elections were mostly, the parliamentary and presidential elections were competitive. So what do I mean they were competitive? So they were, of course, they were not free and fair by any definition, right? They were very, very, very narrow.
You were able to elect within a constrained option pool.
Yes,
right.
Heavily constrained, like very, very heavily constrained. So, for example, if you remember, I spoke about Bazargan, the first prime minister of the Islamic Republic. So he has a sort of a liberal Islamist party, very mild opposition party. But I mean, that party could never dream of even running for parliament, let alone presidency. Although in the height of the sort of democratic opening in the elections in 2000, it came close to running. And I think it was sort of allowed to run for Tehran City Council, to just give you sort of an idea. But most of the time, the option is much, much, much more limited. But in 2021, finally, even that limited option was taken away. So, of course, I didn't vote in 2021, but I did vote in 2017 because even though I didn't like the politics of any of these guys, there was a real option on the table. And I thought it was important to support President Rouhani because he was sort of doing this, because he had just inked the nuclear deal with the West, and sort of I was supporting his direction there. But earlier in life, the elections were as open, but I was more radical, I guess, so I didn't vote ever before that. 2017 is the only time that I did. Right now, I remain a Marxist, but I'm a very participatory consequentialist. So I basically believe in voting in elections almost all the time.
A participatory Marxist.
Yes, well, I think participatory is important because it should be obvious, but it's not, because a lot of Marxists prefer to just sort of don't do anything with the real world and don't participate when they don't have I guess because if socialist revolution is not on the ballot, they'll prefer to stay home. So I don't think that's right. And I said consequentially, so that part is important because if you think voting in an election can make a difference and that difference is good, for what, right? For me, for the ideals that I care for. So that is the short-term, medium-term, and long-term interests of the working people, broadly defined, and the country. Then I believe one has to vote, and peace, and other sort of goals that we can define. That's why, of course, I think people should definitely vote in all democratic countries. And unfortunately, deciding not to, usually it's disastrous, or deciding, or, in case of Israel in last year elections, led to the victory of the right effectively, by which I mean, Meretz and Labor and Balad and Hadash not uniting.
Yeah, so, that's what happened. But I think this was less about voting and more about government being run by children. I think there was a lot of churlishness and irresponsibility displayed on the leadership of the left that failed to unite, failed to operate as a bloc, and basically gave away to the extremism that Netanyahu was willing to court. But we'll put that aside because I still want to ask you a little bit more about Iran.
I do want to get an understanding too of the relationship between Iran and Israel. So I mean, thinking about today, what is the party line on Israel? Like, what does the government profess as its relationship to Israel? And to the extent that it's possible to know, to what extent is that in lockstep with what the Iranian people feel around Israel, or are there divisions within the citizens of Iran around Israel? I'm curious if you have a sense of a read of if there's a division there or not.
No, of course. Yeah, I think there's a very sharp division. So for Khamenei and the leadership of the regime, the leadership of Khamenei himself and the leadership of the IRGC, their line is that Israel should be destroyed. It's a cancerous colonialist imposition on the Middle East, and they should be destroyed. Their official line is that there should be a referendum. Everybody votes to decide what kind of regime would be there. But of course, the referendum would be all Palestinian, Christian, Muslims, and Jews. But they don't obviously mean vast majority of Israeli Jews who actually live there. And at any rate, even though the referendum is something that they would say once in a while, they very openly threaten Israel with destruction. So that's very clearly their line. Their line is that Israel, as I said, it's an imposition that needs to be destroyed, and that Iran has this duty as this Islamist power to play a leading role in destroying it. And of course, it's not just a theoretical line. Today, the Islamic Republic is the only state in the world that actually significantly fights against Israel. This is a basic fact that is often forgotten, right? There's no other state in the world that fights against Israel. It's a very important fact, right? Like, not a shot has been fired from Egypt, from Jordan, from Algeria, from Syria. All these regimes have they give longer speeches against how much they hate Zionism. I mean, not all the countries I named, obviously, but Algeria does, Syria does, Iraq often does, but none of them actually fires a single shot against Israel. Iran is the only one that's doing it. And all the other non-state groups in Iraq, in Yemen, in of course Syria, and of course Lebanon and in Palestine, including Hamas, the only country that gives them financial and weapon support is Iran. Now, of course, Hamas, for example, would also get financial support from Turkey and Qatar, but that's very much in coordination with Israel in one way or the other and aimed at sort of civic purposes, right?
And just 2 points to add for the context of this, the rockets are being shot from Yemen, and sometimes attacks being launched from Syria or from Lebanon are exclusively from Iranian funded, if not Iranian led groups. So in the case of Syria, you'll have factions that are more directly aligned with Iran that will operate in this weird chaotic vacuum that is Syria under Assad. And in the case of Lebanon, it is Hezbollah, which is a direct proxy of Iran. And in Yemen, most recently, it's the Houthis, who are, again, the Iran-sponsored militia in that country that have declared war in Israel. So it is always Iran. In the case of Hamas, it's more interesting because Hamas takes inspiration from Iran, and in addition, obviously, takes missiles and funding, despite being on the opposite side of the Sunni Shiite divide. They're united by their commitment to this revolutionary Islamism and their fight against Israel.
Yeah, so my first book is largely about that. So Qasem Soleimani, what he did, what made him who he was that he was head of the Quds force, or the Jerusalem force, which is the external operations wings of the IRGC, whose job was basically coordinating all these forces that we just named. And all of these forces are independent in a way that, by which I mean they have an independent political existence in their own countries, right? Hezbollah obviously has tens of thousands of supporters in Lebanon, as do all these others. But what gives them arms and significant financial support that allows them to be something more than a non-state actor is Iran, right? That's the critical point here, right? Because non-state actors have a very limited power in the world unless they have state backers, right? That's just part of the sort of reality. Because and the states usually, this is why I wrote the book, frankly. This is what makes it intellectually interesting, because states usually don't like non-state actors getting too strong. They have a sort of agreement with each other. Even if the states were very much against each other, they usually end up uniting against non-state actors. And even Iran has done that at some points. And there are other examples like Afghanistan, others we can look at. But in this case, Iran keeps doing. And the Sunni Shia divide, so let me just say it here. I don't think it's very important, right? Iran has given financial and armed support to Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, which is a Marxist-Leninist party in Palestine, right? It has given support to Assad government. Assad government is not Islamist; it's staunchly secular.
Right.
It's
It's tribal.
Sure, it's of course it's tribal, and so the Alawite ethnicity, which much of the leadership of the regime is from, it's a various forms like 6 to 10% of society in Syria, and it's technically Shia, so that's why it's sort of a lot was made out of this, but it's really only technically Shia, right? And this was my argument always, and I think it's much easier to make now than it was a few years before when it really was the height of sectarianism in the region. But the sort of Sunni Shia stuff is not what really matters. What really matters is Iran's and the Islamic Republic's revolutionary anti-Israel ideology. And to go back to what Vanessa said earlier and to respond there, so this is what the Khamenei wants and this is what the regime wants. But not only this is in sharp contrast to what a lot of Iranian people want. Obviously, I don't have a polling agency, but based on what I see in Iranian society, and I've written about this in a lot of evidence in society, and also just talking to a variety of people that I know. Not only it's in sharp contrast to what Iranians want, it's also in sharp contrast to, I would say, much of the sort of traditional political diplomatic class in Iran. And the reason for that is simple. It's because it's a very stupid idea for Iran to want this. Even if you believe Israel should be destroyed, let's say you totally believe Israel is a legitimate regime, it shouldn't be there, whatever, right? The question that many ask, even openly, and I mean many even sort of public intellectuals in Iran openly, is that who gave this task to Iran? Why should Iran sacrifice itself and give so much of its, pay such a high cost in international isolation, is endangering Iran's own national interest for following this path? Why should they spend billions of dollars on these terrorist groups in Lebanon, in Palestine, in other places that don't align with the values of Iranian people as a whole, and also don't advance Iranian interest in any way, right? So I think it's in sharp contrast to a very large number of Iranians, and I really believe actually it's possible that it will be shelved at some point, after Khamenei is dead, or after there are some changes, because it's really a kind of a suicidal policy. And the interesting point about all of this is that, it would be good if there's real polling to see the real mood in Iranian society. But it's a fact that Iranians, by and large, they don't have a very particular commitment to the Palestinian cause anymore. It's just a fact, whether we like it or not. We're not Arabs, so we're not committed to an Arab cause. Which, some Arab countries, that's different. And also, of course, they hate the fact that their government has basically suppressed them under the name of Palestine, and has wasted their resources in the name of Palestine. So there's very little support in Iranian society for this. And for the reasons of which that I explained, it has brought nothing good for Iranians, and they kind of also look at it sort of, it's interesting. As it says, Syria under Assad, frontline state right next to Israel, has done nothing against Israel all these years. It came within, very close to actually recognizing Israel in 2000 under Assad's father, Hafez Assad, right? Even though anti-Zionism is central to it, even though it's a neighbor of Israel, even though part of Syrian territory is occupied by Israel, they didn't do anything about this. The Syria controlled Lebanon, as you know, occupied Lebanon until 2005. And before that, Israel had occupied part of Lebanon, and Syria was occupying Lebanon. Even then, so the point is, why should Iranians spend all this time and energy and political and diplomatic and economic capital to do something that's not a core? It's in no way in Iran's interest. And if anything actually is in our interest, Iran as a unique country and civilization in this region should have good relations with everybody, which is what it did under the Shah before 1979, where we had excellent relations with Arab countries and Israel, while Iran opposed the occupation of Palestinian territories. Shah very sternly opposed them, publicly opposed them, privately opposed them, and was very stern at Israelis when he needed to. But he did not have a one-sided take or a destructive campaign against Israel. In fact, Shah often told Arabs that, look, You have to realize Israel is a fact of life. It's going to remain in this region. It's not going to go anywhere. Something that they come to realize in later decades. But Shah already told them that in the 60s. Even Iranian diplomatic political class. Like, I believe if you poll the Iranian ambassadors today, the ambassadors of the Islamic Republic, if you polled them honestly, right, I don't think they'll be in favor of this policy that Iran has in regards to Israel.
So I do want to get to the current conflict in the few minutes we have left. So to what's at hand. So I don't want to waste any time on the disclaimers because, like I said at the beginning, it's not about like trying to catch somebody at you did not condemn this enough or you did not show. So just we can stipulate that Hamas committed an awful atrocity. This is Gaza. We can stipulate that the occupation in the West Bank and the Netanyahu government's policy of perpetuating the conflict, managing the conflict, as the phrase is called, has been at minimum. Everybody can agree that has backfired tragically on the Israeli people, and I think, and from my perspective personally, has been always morally reprehensible. We can stipulate that the tragedy of the Palestinian people in the West Bank and in Gaza is an awfully complex situation that both Palestinian authorities and the Israeli government have been fully complicit in perpetuating, and that all of this is tragic, and truly the only non-genocidal solution to this region is a two-state solution that will have to require the sort of true leadership from both sides to figure out how to overcome the extremists in their own house and make that deal with some probably internationally guaranteed security. Can we mostly stipulate on all these pieces before we move forward?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I broadly agree. I mean, I would say that, yes, I am a two-way status in this way. Because I think it's a much more plausible solution, which I actually think it's very plausible. I think it's possible to make that happen in a relatively short amount of time. And I think it's the preferred solution of everybody. But of course, if there is a scenario to imagine that you could also have some sort of a one-state solution if everyone sort of wants to join the state. But I don't see it as a real political possibility. Like if you think US and Canada should join each other and become one country, which is fine, basically, right? It's definitely not a bad thing or a genocidal thing, but you need to convince Americans and Canadians, right? Nobody in Palestine, no political force in Palestine or Israel wants the one-state solution. That's a fact. Very loud people in Brooklyn, including Jewish Americans, might want that. But I find it sort of a bit ironic. This is the solution that we put forward that is not wanted by anyone actually in these places. Right. I find that sort of ironic. By the
way, I don't find it ironic at all. I just find it incredibly, incredibly dishonest and lazy, which I think is really what's happening. And to go back to our previous point, is symptomatic of Western commentariat and the left as much as the right, but the left conceives of itself as more worldly and intellectual than the right often does, and therefore I will hold it to a higher standard and just point out that this is nothing but intellectual laziness, borderline cruelty in this dishonest, actual arbitrary disregard to the reality of people in the region, and I mean both Israelis and Palestinians.
I mean, it's an imperialistic idea. You see the problem with saying, we want the one-state solution there, right? It's fine. The problem is that you think people's political identities is something that you can just sort of wish away. You just say, I think the just solution is that we move the borders in the same, we change your political identity. It's a silly thing to say. People's political, and I think for Americans, it's hard to understand it because they're born in a very secure political identity, right? They're Americans, they're citizens of this superpower. Their political identity is given. They can also burn the American flag and say, we hate America, because it doesn't actually mean anything, right?
Yeah, all of this is what I've been calling peace privilege. They suffer a severe case of peace privilege that allows them to entertain the most de facto imperialistic worldview.
Let me tell you one funny example of this. There's this letter in N+1, about sort of defending an anti-Zionist position, and it's written by a lot of Jewish American artists, and a lot of great things in this letter. But there's a phrase, which I totally understand, and I think there's a lot of bad faith accusations of anti-Semitism, which is especially painful against of course, Jewish people. So I totally understand all of that. There's a phrase there that is interesting for me. They sort of say, we don't seek a statist solutions. What does that even mean? You don't seek a statist solutions because you have a state that you're secure in it. Is there any artist in this country who doesn't rely on a state funding for arts, for example? After all, this is what the neoliberal right wants. They don't like the state. We forgot, right? The whole point of the left is to support society, which means in some sort of a way includes the state, unless you're not sort of anarchist. So I think it's sort of symbolic of that, right? Is that it's very easy to say these things without really acknowledging the reality of the world in which you live in which states exist. What kind of state you belong to is an important matter. Political identities really matter. Is not just I hear it very funny. People say, "Oh well, one institution is great." Well, it's a joke way of looking at the world, right? For anybody, forget all the weight of history, the history of Israel, its wars, the history of Jewish identity, the history of Zion. Anywhere in the world, you want to change a border between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, I'm sure you're going to have serious fights.
Oh my God.
But somehow you think you can join Palestine and Israel and just say, they become one country.
And that's without the New Jersey charter saying the trees and the stone will find the last Pennsylvanian for you to kill.
Maybe New Jersey charter should say that.
So you've been using your public platform to call for a ceasefire and trying to platform or signal boost the best crowds or the best movements that have been joining this call. And I don't want to be cloying about this, but even in my situation as an Israeli, my heart truly breaks when I think of the casualties right now, the death of civilians in Gaza. The numbers are horrendous, and I hated the number games when pseudo journalists were trying to talk about whether there were 32 babies or 49 babies or how many heads were severed, and I do not respect that kind of talk when we were looking at civilian deaths on the Gazan side. And it doesn't, those numbers don't even matter when it comes to hundreds or thousands. It is truly a human tragedy, and Israel is probably already responsible for, and if not yet, will soon be some sort of war crimes, because war crimes almost inevitably happen during war, no matter if you trust the IDF to conduct itself carefully or not. It doesn't matter. War crimes will be committed. So again, I want to stipulate all that to ask you, how do you get, because you're pragmatic in your thinking, how do you get Israel to truly accept a ceasefire at this moment, short of the full dismantling of Hamas? And I don't know I shouldn't say full dismantling, but short of some significant harm to Hamas, if not completely extinguishing its political power in Gaza.
I mean, that's, you put it there, right? The question is, what is the military goal of this operation, right? Yoav Gallant, the defense minister of Israel, a couple of days ago, he openly said, if we kill Yahya Sinwar, we can finish the operation sooner. That's an absolutely mad way of running a military operation. Number one, you named it, so you want to kill this one guy.
So now he's definitely going to be right. He's going to be shipped to Qatar.
And this is a high leader in Hamas, I assume.
That's right. Yes, that's Hamas's main leader in Gaza.
Right.
Right.
And the person behind probably the military strategy of the October 7th attack.
Yeah, and I mean, Mohammed Daif is probably the person sort of who operated it, but yes, Senvar would be the sort of political leader in Gaza. But at any rate, the reason. So why do I call for a ceasefire, and how, why do I think it would be also in Israel's interest? First of all, because Israel currently does not seem to have a workable military plan. And at the end of the day, the attack as of October 7th were horrendous and unprecedented. They were a huge failing on part of Israel.
100%.
One has to remember.
100%.
So in terms of sort of intelligence and defense, it's one reason why Netanyahu is so now widely hated in Israel. I mean, all polls show and all reactions show. If you look, actually, it's kind of amazing if you look at it, because even most right-wing people by this point, and I really mean most, I'm not using it colloquially.
No, that's not hyperbole. First of all, we know that all pollings that we've been seeing from Israel shows around 80% of Israelis across the board blame Netanyahu for the damage of the attack, and I'm certainly one of them. And you've seen at least one poll that if elections were held today, his party would lose about half its mandates, which I think is not nearly enough to reflect the utter failure of his long-term and short-term policy.
Exactly. So I think it's a huge failing on part of Netanyahu and the government there. But yeah, so I think Israel, the problem of Gaza is ultimately a political problem, right? What did Israel think it would happen, right? Keeping this territory in the siege like this, effectively working to strengthen Hamas. I mean, that's, again, you have to remember Netanyahu's policy was to prop up Hamas, ignore the fact of all its links to Iran. By prop up, of course, I'm not posing some sort of a conspiracy theory here, but the fact is,
the idea it is overtly the strategy of the Netanyahu government to prop up Hamas in the sense of counterweight to the Fatah party in the West Bank, and basically create an equilibrium that in his mind kept Israel safe and stable without having to actually address the underlying the fundamentals of the conflict.
Exactly. So at the moment it has killed thousands of civilians in Gaza, of course. It has diplomatically isolated itself. If you look at the UN, if you look at reactions of a lot of countries, so look at the countries of the region, many of which have relations with Israel, many of which were ready to even expand relations with Israel. It's really put them in a hard place. Not to mention the threat of a broader, war in the region. So nothing good comes out of continuation of this campaign.
No, but here I need to stop you. So I might be wrong, but I doubt that maybe except for Algeria, any of the other partners of the Abraham Accord or the future partners like Saudi Arabia would care if this gets resolved within even a month. They need to make the statements now. We know, of course, they need to take a stand against Israel. But with a political change in Israel, things could pick up in those relations.
No, things could change for sure.
No, I'm saying that the alienation is not an indication in itself. But the thing that you need to weigh the question of a ceasefire against is, as far as I see it, ignoring the notion of justice and taking vengeance on Hamas, because I think that's a confounding feature, although you might argue is important, but put that aside. There are two things that you need to consider, right? One is Israel's deterrence. And Israel's deterrence, as you said yourself, partly due to Israel's own failure, if not largely due to Israel's own failure. But the fact is that Israel's deterrent power, which is possibly the most important asset that it has cultivated over the past 70 years in a very hostile neighborhood, as the phrase goes, is now completely destroyed. And without executing a long, concentrated war that actually leads to a tangible result that shows that you fucked with us, we fuck with you, and you will suffer the consequences. The consequences not being civilian death, because that again, putting aside the absolute moral monstrosity of harming civilians, but it also doesn't really serve Israel's strategic purpose. However, getting the heads of Hamas leaders or dismantling the tunnel infrastructure, or doing something that is tangibly harming the power of Hamas in Gaza. Without doing that, Israel retreating or agreeing to a ceasefire without that will just put a giant mark on the whole country for Iran to dial up the game next time around with Hezbollah, because it shows that Israel is penetrable. The seeming impregnability of its borders has been disproven, and now and whenever it tries to retaliate, the world will rein it in.
But to be honest,
That's a calculus. And that's number one. So if you want to answer that, and then I'll ask you about the second problem.
So, I don't get this logic, frankly. Because, Israel should be able to guard its borders. The fact that it wasn't in October 7th, and frankly, it's embarrassing for a country with, which gets billions of dollars of military help from the United States, which has itself, it's a first world country in terms of richness. It has all this massive economic budget. It has a conscription service, has this massive army. It's embarrassing for it to need operations to prove it has deterrence against a terror group that has to get its rockets in indirect ways, from Iran, from other places, which is blockaded on the other side by Egypt, right? It's frankly a little embarrassing for it.
I agree with you completely that it's embarrassing, and I think that one of the most important things that need to come out of this, and I really worry that this will not happen, but it definitely needs to, is the public dragging, shaming, tarring and feathering, and if not, maybe putting to a tribunal of the current government of Israel for its failure. I think there are many other moral reasons to do that, but at minimum, because of its failure to leverage its enormous security machine to protect its civilians. I completely agree with you, but the point is not that logically this is Israel's fault for not using all that. All that is true, but if in order to solve the problem, to solve the equation, right, you need to take into account the interests of both players in this game. And from the Israeli perspective, there is no world in which getting into a ceasefire without any tangible results makes sense.
Well, I think the most tangible result is to bring the hostages home. So the idea of ceasefire is that, of course, it would be with the release of all hostages, maybe perhaps with exchange with some Palestinian prisoners. That's the more important tangible result. Israel has given a lot more before for them, and also the more important.
No, but Arash, about Israel given more before, very well, because I know how closely you're paying attention to this, but you know that the psyche in Israel has changed after this. So Israel was willing to release, despite a lot of public outcry, by the way, in the past, more than 1,000 prisoners in order to release Gilad Shalit, and has also agreed to equally disproportional in terms of like just sheer numbers, to get the bodies of dead soldiers that were kidnapped by Hezbollah. Israel has been historically willing to make these grotesque deals, but you know that the logic is different. You know that Israel.
Sure, the logic is different, but look,
different place now psychologically in terms of what they will really. And I guess this actually takes me to my second point, which you might want to incorporate in your answers, which is the public in Israel is not going to trust a government that is unable to retaliate and reach results given the atrocity that happened. Even though, as we both agree fully, the government itself is responsible for the magnitude of the atrocity. But the public is not going to accept a ceasefire, a government that will sign a ceasefire without something that shows tangible harm to Hamas.
Well, it's look, we keep talking about psychology. The real question here for all Israelis, whether it was in government or it's a small society relatively. So there's not a big difference between sort of Israeli people and their government, which after all is elected. By which it's an important question for all of them. And I think, by the way, this is where leadership matters, right? Because leaders are those who are able to take their people and their emotions and their feelings and their sort of psychologies to somewhere. The question is, what's the plan? Even the way you're posing it, look at it, talk about hurting Hamas. Frankly, it's not a high school fight. So you hurt Hamas, then what? Israel has killed so much of its opponents and its political leaders, often in extrajudicial ways, leaders of political and military leaders of
We're
its
talking
opponents.
historically. We're talking historically because Israel has conducted operations of assassinating Hamas leaders in the past. So it's not just in this during this.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
No, I know. I'm giving context to people who don't know the region.
Yeah, exactly. And it's done for this decades, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas it's not going to bring it peace. It's not going to bring it. And you think, Khaled Mash'al the other day was on Al Arabiya. He said, Palestinians are a martyred nation. This is one of the leaders of Hamas. Palestinians are a martyred nation. Millions of people died in the Vietnam War and the Second World War, and we're ready to give them all to fight. So when we say deterrence, it's not like these people make those kind of calculations. They already know that an attack on Israel, they're not the ones who are doing the dying. Like, as much as Israel might find them and kill them here and there, but most of the time, they can hide enough, right? And if they die, some other people will carry on. And anyways, when they're in Doha, Israel is not going to bomb Doha.
No,
right?
By the way, totally want to draw a line under what you just said, because the problem of causing harm to Hamas is exactly encapsulated by this point, because of the death cult component of Hamas and of at least some factions within Hamas and their willingness to martyr their own people in the process. The question of
so let me say something. Let me say something to that. So here's a crazy idea. Maybe the goal shouldn't be just bringing harm on the group, but finding lasting solutions. After all, after the 73 Yom Kippur War, which Israel was, of course, very different circumstances. Egyptians were trying to get their own country. But they committed a lot of atrocities.
Yeah, no, but the 73 war with Egypt, the Yom Kippur War, right? The reason that led to peace was in part that the war was waged in Sadat's mind, at least in part, as leverage for creating a new status quo. He entertained the possibility of peace. It was not. He did not launch a genocidal war. He launched a war.
Of course, but I'm not saying Israel should make peace with Hamas
on the ground.
Yeah, but I'm not saying Israel should make peace with Hamas, right? Of course, I don't think that's really possible. I don't think Hamas, as it exists today, certainly it's not a force that can, force that created those genocidal attacks on October 7th. It really shows the sort of their extreme brutality. If there was any, I would say it really shocked me, just as a personal sort of, knowing all the Hamas brutalities is the Iranian regime's brutalities, it is still shocking me. But I'm saying Israel needs to have a long-term political approach to this question. And if you just go into this, we need to solve immediate results. What is the immediate results? How much of Gaza are they going to kill? How much of Gaza are they going to destroy? This is this little strip. Nothing has been left of it. Lives of its people has been just war and destruction and blockade for as long as they remember. Half of it of our children. What's the end goal here?
No, I agree.
Whereas there is an alternative. Alternative is work with Arab countries, work with Saudi Arabia, work with the Palestinian Authority. Try to find a political solution. Give Gaza back to some sort of an Arab/Palestinian Authority force, and find a way out of this. That's what should come out of it.
But for context, this is what Israel is doing right now. There's talks between the Israel government and Jordan and the UAE, and there's talks about creating some Arab coalition that will be responsible for Gaza. So when I'm talking about causing harm to Hamas, I don't think anybody in Israel, well, I shouldn't say anybody, we have our own component of crazies who are usually overrepresented in the settler community, but not exclusively, who are truly genocidal or truly destructive, right? So that component exists. Those are the people who vote for Ben Gvir. Those are the people who vote for Smotrich, and the harm of their political power over Israel is something that I talked about a lot. So I don't want to get into this right now because I'm going to put that aside. And thankfully, they are not the reigning majority at this moment in Israel. They have overpower and specifically have been overrepresented in this current government because of Netanyahu's willingness to carve out a government with them, which is what I think the most repugnant thing in his problematic to repugnant reign in Israeli politics. But I don't want to focus on them because I think that the Israeli consensus politically isn't that we're going into a forever war in Gaza, nor is it that we are going to level Gaza completely and create a second Nakba. The point is that there needs to be some actual direct damage done to Hamas. And now you might argue that this damage has been done and there's nothing better that can be achieved with this, which actually I think is a really good argument that you are not going to get anything more at this point. But there's no dispute, I think, in Israel that there has to be a few Gaza for tomorrow. Again, except for the actual messianic genocidal part of government that thankfully are increasingly being ousted from public life. But we need to work with whoever is willing to basically create a buffer within Gaza and allow for some political future in that little strip of land that is self-reliant and is able to work with Israel, because there is nothing Israel wants more than to be able to just step back from Gaza and not have to worry about it. There is no desire on the Israeli side to control Gaza. There's no desire in Israel's side to inflict pain on Palestinians.
Gaza comes with West Bank. Gaza comes with West Bank.
I think
it's
so.
A reality.
Right.
Yeah.
But
it's a reality. We shouldn't forget this, right? We shouldn't forget this. For a more than a generation, Israelis, this is Israeli people. It's not just some bad guys in the government. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of Israelis convinced themselves that millions of people in the West Bank can live under occupation, can live under these terrible conditions, longest occupation in the world, and this shouldn't even be an issue in Israel. It wasn't even an issue in elections, right? For many years now.
Arash, I want to agree with you completely, because I think what you're saying
linked to this, though.
We're in full agreement on this point. I just want to separate them for a second. I know that there is a part which can't be separated and shouldn't be separated, but because we're talking about this war, I don't think that the question of ceasefire is directly tied to the West Bank. Now, the West Bank. So, and this is all I'm going to say about this, and you can disagree with me because they are tethered in terms of Israel's responsibility to resolve this. I don't think it is. I think because of the conditions of October 7th, Israel needs to be in a state where the international community, if it wants ceasefire, needs to show up how it's going to evolve a plan that answers these concerns from the Israeli side for Gaza specifically, both on the humanitarian front towards Gaza, but also towards the security concerns and also the prevention of Hamas being able to amass power and basically take over whatever new political entity exists in Gaza. And without that, I don't see how Israel can just sit into a ceasefire. The international community that is trying to pressure Israel into a ceasefire without addressing these concerns is not serious, in my view, is not actually serious about trying to prevent more harm to civilians.
Look, I'll say this. We have to remember, you say international community pressuring Israel. Israel, like any other country in the world, doesn't have the right to kill civilians. It kills civilians in very large numbers. The reason international community pressures Israel, and in fact, the international community doesn't really pressure Israel in the way that it could. The United States effectively gives a blank check to Israel to do whatever it wants. It has unbelievable support on all levels. No other country could imagine having this kind of support while committing this kind of military operations. In Europe, there's widespread support. There's effectively now suspension of democratic threats to suspend democratic liberties in Europe for sort of anti-Israel demonstrations,
which is horrible and disgusting. And I agree with you completely.
Of course, yeah. But my point is, so this is the worst Israel has at the moment, right? And it has not, it is not conducting this war in a way. And frankly, it's very, very hard to, you earlier said every war will have war crimes. It's true, but conducting a war in a place as small as Gaza, even if it wants to all the time to avoid all civilian casualties, which I'm not convinced actually that's the case, but even if it wants to, it won't be able to. So Israelis, I would end with saying this, right? The problem in politics in a lot of places in the world, and I think this is not limited to Israel, is that there's sort of a short-term views all the time. And Israel has done this throughout its history. Right? Hamas today exists for a large degree because of the decisions that Israel has taken in the past, right? And I could go, on a very long time. Even, let's say, killing someone like Sheikh Yassin. Islamic Republic is not really sectarian, actually, it's sort of murderous ideology, but it's not sort of Shia sectarian. But Hamas historically was, right? How is it that it's able to become a force totally under the leadership of Iran? Well, killing of some of its sort of main, more traditional leaders at some point, closing off all other sort of political avenues in Palestine at the main point, and some other parts. These are all had roots in. So my point is, short-term thinking of next week, next month, next year it's a dangerous thing and has happened a lot and happens in the region. I say, for the interest of Israel itself, for the interest of my Israeli friends, for the national interest of this small country in our region, which faces tough times, it needs to adopt long-term thinking. And, so it's not just a matter of ceasefire today or not. I believe the ceasefire is necessary, of course, and I sort of tried to say why. But more importantly, it needs to adopt long-term thinking. This living by the sword, living on war after war, living on the basis of sort of operation after operation, it is not sustainable in the long term, right? And there is what's the good news? And let us not forget that the good news is, with the exception of Iran, every other country in the region, none of them wants to fight Israel. They have all accepted that Israel is going to be there. They've all accepted that, not all of them have established relations with it, but let us not forget, every single Arab country signed up to the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002. And in Iran, on the popular level, people don't want to fight Israel. Even on the political elite level, beyond Khamenei and this terrorist supports, they don't want that. So Israel has that good hand. It can use it. It can use it to find itself a permanent peace in this region. And that's what it should seek towards, right? That every single day that it continues its operations, it will hurt its own political capitals. Killing hundreds of kids and people and civilians, so that some fourth level Hamas political leader is also killed somewhere. Even if you just look at it from the interest of Israel, what it loses in moral support around the world and political support in the region around the world is much more, right? So that is what I would say. And Arab countries that we spoke about earlier, these countries are not democracies, but they have populations. The space for these populations to also accept deals with Israel will shrink as much as this war continues. And it's been, let us not forget, already a month that it has gone on. It should end, and Israel should work with the countries in the region for long-term solution for Gaza, and for the other Palestinian territories.
Arash, this is great. I know we've been keeping you longer, and I just want to add before you go, because I cut you just as you were making the point about Israel complacency regarding the West Bank. I want to make sure that this point doesn't get lost, because I completely agree with this, and I think that one of the biggest problem of the past 20 years, basically since the Second Intifada, is that the idea of managing the conflict has gained too much traction, and the idea is that you can turn off your brain and not deal with it as long as the border security is strong enough, and you prevent the excess of intifada-like attacks within Israel. Then the occupation is not really happening, and the harm to Palestinians and the damage, psychological and human damage to the Palestinian street is ignorable. And I think this is morally outrageous and is also just undeniably short-term thinking. So I completely wanted to make sure that it didn't seem as if I was skirting this point.
No, of course, and I'm happy that we agree. And I should say, mention Second Intifada. It's important to remember that atrocities by Hamas didn't start yesterday. Hamas's atrocities in the Second Intifada are helped derail peace, as did, of course, the killing of Rabin and this region.
They derail the Israeli left, I would say. I think that
exactly, yeah, they derailed and destroyed. And this region's sad history is that this region is full of peace-seeking leaders who were killed because they sought peace. Ishaq Rabin Anwar Sadat, Abdullah, first the King of Jordan, Sartawi, one of the leaders of PLO. So many people who wanted peace and represent the peace demands of millions of these people gave their lives to the extremists. So I think that's a good guide to have, to have the sort of political and moral courage for the path of peace, and sidelining the extremists as hard as it can be.
Can I tell you one last thing before you go?
Of course.
And this is something that I think you also intuitively understand, given some of your tweets and comments on this issue, because I think you understand the Israeli psychology better than, I'd say, half, if not most, of American Jews. But we
are unlike the Americans. I'm actually from the Middle East, so
right. No, exactly. No, I think that's, like I said, like same for me. You can't take the Middle East out of the man. But the reason that I think that my issue with the ceasefire discourses, which is not the question with the ceasefire, because I want a ceasefire. I want to protect civilian lives, and I kind of am convinced by your point that there is no better solution that we can necessarily achieve militarily. Not fully convinced, but I'm very open to that point. My issue with the ceasefire discourse goes to something that I think we broadly agree on, which is the performative nature of American left discourse, and sometimes the way that it can give cover to more radical anti-Israel Islamism under the cover of pseudo desire for peace. And sometimes that's done naively, sometimes that's done nefariously. But Israel is at this point, the Israeli public, that I think is at a really precarious but interesting place where they see the failure of the right. And I've heard many people say that in the same way that the Second Intifada killed the Israeli left, October 7th may have dealt a deadly blow to the Israeli right. So the possibility of Israelis to wake up from the bluster of Ben Gvir and Netanyahu and their chest thumping about being the tsars of security and realizing how pathetically dangerous and demagogic they have been, that they have led the country down the path of destruction, creates a window for Israelis to take your call for long-term thinking, to embrace long-term thinking, and to understand that Israel needs to be responsible for its crimes in the West Bank and for the conditions in Gaza. There is a window for this, and I think it's real. But I think that as long as the international left embraces or spends time arguing even about whether or not From the River to the Sea is genocidal or not, or what does ceasefire mean, or even make the case for one-state solution, what the Israeli public hears is, well, maybe the world is just okay with the atrocities.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the biggest gift to the Israeli right has been the international left and the anti-Israel position in the international left. If I was theoretician of Israeli right, I would funnel money to all this sort of anti-Israel groups around the world. They prove its point. They prove its point. They prove its point that Israelis have nowhere to go, that they're isolated. If you're a young Israeli with a bit of inclinations to the left, let's say, like normal people everywhere, if you come to an average American campus and you see the kind of thing that exists against Israel, you're very likely to turn right. And I think so. I definitely agree with you there. But the international left doesn't have good foreign relations for sure, right? As we see in Russia and Ukraine generally, but it also has very little political power. I would say the part that matters, if you look at of course, Bernie Sanders and sort of foreign policy thinkers in the U.S. like Matt Doss and others. I mean, they've been much more reasonable on Israel and on other points. They don't have that anti-Israel obsession that many others have, so there is hope there. There is hope for a democratic left that has reasonable policies and also sort of abandons this rather silly anti-Israel obsession that is current everywhere. But I agree with you that it has really been destructive for the region, and unfortunately, I think the unfortunate fact is that the pro-Palestine movement has or sections of it that are the loudest, has banked itself on this. But it's not in the ultimate interest of Palestinians either. The Palestinian National Movement, pro-Palestinian movement, needs to understand its real allies are Israeli progressives in Haifa and Tel Aviv and Netanya, because they are the ones he has to actually live with and deal with. You can have, 6 very radical people in Brooklyn who, they'll say anything you want them to say. It doesn't change anything in their lives. It doesn't even change the flavor of the coffee they're going to drink the day after. So, of course, they'll take any radical positions you want because it doesn't affect anything for them. Politics is about the stakes. And the real allies are not on the campuses in the US and Germany. The real allies are people in the region and people in the Arab countries, actually, working toward a solution that is practical for them in this generation. And the other thing about war and ceasefire and the stuff that we talk about, it's not an abstraction. I mean, you're an Israeli, I'm Iranian. If this war continues, it's us who will have to go and fight and die. It's not like some other people who will do it, right? When these bombs comes, it's our families who will have to die. Again, unlike some other people who don't have an actual skin in the game. And that's why I think that's the sort of a spirit of the piece. And unfortunately, we live in a time where when you say these things, you're supposed to be, you're just in the middle, or you don't want to say anything, or you don't want to commit to anything. I would say, yes, I do want, I do want peace. Because I want me and my friends to be able to live and to live normal lives. Not ones of death and war. And I think it's definitely possible, and we should work for it.
Well,
thank
Arash,
you, Arash.
Thank you so much.
This was great. I really enjoyed listening.
Thank
to
you so much,
too.
Vanessa. Thank you. I hope we didn't bore you at all, but thank you so much.